Okay, I think it's time to start. People will continue to join slowly. Let me just open this session. This is the second session of the CEPS Intereconomics conference, COVID-19 from lockdown to recovery. The focus of this session is on the economic response to COVID-19 in the EU. I have to admit that when we designed the program, we were hoping to be discussing the state of the recovery and basically thinking of the post-COVID-19. I mean, the facts of the last day are not very reconforting in this sense. So I guess the discussion of today will also focus on the second wave of the pandemic and its impact. And to have this discussion, we have a great set of panelists. I'm really honored and pleased to introduce them to you. Commissioner Gentiloni, EU Commissioner for the Economy, Natacha Valla, Dean at Sciences Po, School of Management and Innovation, and Jörg Kukies is the State Secretary at the Federal Ministry of Finance in Germany. Let me just say a few words about the EU response. In May, the Commission came up with a very ambitious package, the Next Generation EU. Within it, the Recovery and Resilience Facility will be able to distribute very large amounts of funds to all member states, which have been dealing with the impact of the COVID-19 and the economic crisis which followed to it. As I said earlier, now the situation is changing in the sense that most of the forecasts were based on one wave of the recovery. Probably numbers will have to be updated again very soon, and member states will have to probably consider potential additional measures. That said, let's focus first on the EU response to COVID. And I would like to ask the Commissioner how is looking at the current situation and what kind of policy implication we can draw from the current situation about the EU response to COVID and Next Generation EU more in general. Commissioner, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to participate to CEPS Intereconomics conference, albeit virtually. The situation is that we are in the second phase of this pandemic very clearly, and that any misplaced complacency there may have been during the summer that the public health crisis was behind us has been shattered by the last couple of weeks. So Europe is experiencing a strong second phase of the pandemic across all the continent. And indeed, many countries that escaped relatively lightly in the spring are now seeing an alarming rise in cases, with hospitalization and deaths sadly now also rising steadily. Though mercifully, the latter until now is well below the levels experienced at the peak of the first phase. Of course, the pandemic is causing human suffering. People in hospitals and with serious difficulties, social inequalities, and human suffering also through the economic implication. To have an idea of the scale of the economic implication, we should remember that the financial crisis of 2009 saw the EU economy contract by 4.5%, and in the second quarter of this year, the euro area GDP shrank by 11.8%. And with a very different range from 4% to 18% in different member states of the Union. For 2020 as a whole, the IMF projects a decline, IMF because it's a more recent forecast, a decline in euro area GDP of 8.3, that would be the double, more or less, of what happened in the financial crisis. I am due to present next week the Commission's own autumn forecast for the period 2020 and 2022. And of course, without the support decided by national governments, about 3.5 trillion euros between fiscal and liquidity support and guarantees, and without the European recovery, this impact would have been much worse. It was clear, I think it was clear already in March that the symmetric shock of COVID would have provoked a very asymmetric crisis. So a common crisis needing a common response, but one which needs to be targeted to where support is most required. Of the package decided in the Eurogroup just before Easter, you could call it the Maundy Thursday Agreement. The first to become operational is the SURE mechanism in support to Cassa Integrazione, Kurzarbeit, Chômage Partiel, and this kind of mechanism. The first SURE payments for a total of 17 billion are about to take place to Italy, Spain, and Poland, and this follows the very successful first sale of SURE social bonds last week. You know that they were almost 14 times oversubscribed, and this is also a very welcome vote of confidence in the European Union's broader recovery plan, Next Generation EU and Recovery and Resilience Facility. The plans for this facility will be drawn up not by the Commission, but by each member state. So each member state will be responsible for the reforms and investments in question. The Commission's role will be very important. We are not financial intermediaries, only transferring money to member states. And the role will be to closely assess each plan submitted to make sure that it corresponds to the goals of the facility, and namely to contribute to the green and digital transition, to foster growth, job creation, and resilience, and to respond to the country-specific recommendation. The first point is crucial, the green and digital transition. Some feared and maybe hoped that the pandemic would lead Europe to retreat from its ambitious climate and sustainability commitments. The opposite is true. And it is interesting to take note of the announcements coming in these weeks, initially from China and yesterday especially from Japan, on climate neutrality goals. As you know, we have strengthened our resolve for the Green Deal and seized the opportunity offered by the recovery plan to put sustainability at the heart of our economic policy. The Commission has proposed to increase to 55% the reduction in emissions to be achieved by 2030. We have specified that of the financing to be made available to each member states through the RRF, 37% should contribute to the green transition, with a further 20% to contribute to the digital transition. And we have finally committed that 30% of the issuance that will occur to fund Next Generation EU will be in green bonds. That's in addition to the fact that all the 100 billion of the SURE mechanism will be through social bonds. Next Generation EU can be one of the largest stimulus packages anywhere in the world, unleashing transformative investment and reforms in a host of key areas. And this is the challenge, to keep together facing emergency, because we are still in the need of facing emergency, and transforming through the recovery our economies. From renewables and grid infrastructure to energy efficient buildings and sustainable transport, from 5G and artificial intelligence to public and private sector digitalization, to programs for continuous learning, training, and reskilling that will be equally important. It will be crucial that member states put in place strong coordination structures to ensure that they can absorb and spend in the most effective way the immense sums that will be available in a short amount of time. The Commission will work in close partnership to help member states if needed in this sense, because this will be a test case for the Union as a whole. If we make a success of it, we will have laid the groundwork and provided a blueprint for how to tackle downturns in the future. As the shadow of the pandemic lengthens once more over Europe, governments are again having to take some incredibly hard decisions, shuttering restaurants, cafes, museums, and theaters, restricting social contacts and movements. These measures are unfortunately necessary to once again flatten the curve, even if we know that they are likely to significantly slow economic activity in the fourth quarter of this year, after a very good third quarter. There are two key policy implications, and these are my final remarks, from the latest developments. First, that the co-legislators must redouble their efforts to close the deal on the MFF and the Next Generation EU without further delay. The sooner that happens, the sooner the ratification process can get underway, and the sooner Next Generation EU can begin to be implemented. And I know that the German presidency is fully committed to this goal. And second, that we need to maintain support to the economy as much as is needed for as long as is needed. I believe that we have learned our lessons from the past. We have already made clear that our general escape clause will remain in place throughout next year and as long as necessary. The discussion about how and when to normalize fiscal policy is one that I believe cannot be held in isolation from the discussion on how to improve our economic governance framework. Several interesting ideas have already been put forward, for instance, by the European Fiscal Board, on the creation of a permanent fiscal capacity, on mechanisms to facilitate investment, and on how to adapt our policies to reflect the reality of the much higher debt levels we will see in a large number of member states after the pandemic. And next year, once Next Generation EU is up and running, it will be time for the Commission to put on the table our proposal in this area. So I think that until now, Europe's institutions and member states have collectively demonstrated strong determination. And through the long and difficult winter that lies ahead of us, we must maintain that determination. If we can do that, I am confident that Europe can emerge stronger from these challenging times. Thank you.
Many thanks, Commissioner, for sharing with us your thoughts and for actually restating in a very clear way that the position of the Commission. Let me now move to Natacha. Natacha, you have been working in different EU institutions. In this sense, I think you are in a very privileged position to look at next generation EU from a broader perspective. For instance, the role of monetary policy, but also the role that other institutions can play in actually implementing the EU response. So please, your views on this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cinzia, for inviting me and for this very prestigious panel. I'm humbled, but that's also a topic which is very close to my heart. I took up three messages from Commissioner Gentiloni's words, which I deeply share. The one is that the green and digital remains at the core of the money that's being spent. And I think that's really key for Europe to be sending this message also in a context of a recovery plan, which is also, a crisis management, counter-cyclical instrument. I also noticed that there was the need for a true coordination mechanism across member states in the way the money is going to be spent, and I will come back to that. I think this is one of the really the focus point when it comes to the implementation of the plan. And the third one, of course, we're all there, but watching very closely the ratification process, and I can only hope as well that this is going to be as smooth and as fast as possible, because we need the money to be spent very soon. But to come back maybe on a few general dimensions, I think the plan was really well thought. I mean, when you read it, you don't necessarily see all the tensions, all the compromises, all the difficulties that were there when we were watching it happening before the summer. And this three-pillar structure is well balanced, I find, because it's a way, and when you read it at first sight, it looks really, and that's what it is, I think, a crisis management plan, a plan where money is being spent as a macroeconomic policy measure, not necessarily, but it will be, though, a little bit of that as well, and very much of that, not necessarily thought as a structural policy, but I think it very much has the scope and the size to be a very strong underpinning for pan-European structural policies. Yeah, and I think it's also a good balance, in a sense, ex post seen, that might be a difficulty in the ratification process, but a good balance between grants and loans, a good balance between money and guarantees. Because I think in those cases, when you have to act so fiercely, so boldly, you need to spend the money, you need to support, demand in the short term. You also need to make sure that supply is being addressed, but it needs to be done in an incentive compatible way. And I think a lot of thinking has been done as much as possible on those incentive compatibility constraints. Now, a second point I wanted to make, and then I will come to the investment that will be channeled through that money, has to do with the financing of it. And to me, ever since it was announced, and that was really the stake in July, when it came out that there would be an issuance capacity at the EU level to support at least part of the money, that was really, really a game changer. I remember I was still, I just came out of the ECB now a few months ago. So I very much have a central banker perspective on it. And I can tell you that we've been implementing monetary policy for years, missing that thing that was really missing in Europe, which is the European safe assets, which is this instrument that allows monetary policy to be expressed in the way it is expressed right now, meaning intervening at very long maturities in sovereign markets. We were needing this bond instrument, this sovereign or supra-sovereign bond instrument, that would not be then requiring a very strong, careful filtering through, say, the capital key of the ECB, that would not require looking at how much German bond you can buy against Italian debt or French debt, which was really, I wouldn't say it was an impediment, but it was an unnecessary constraint in the implementation of a loose monetary policy that comes as a backup and as a multiplier, in fact, to the impact that fiscal policy, and in particular this plan, will have on economic recovery and on economic growth in Europe. So I think we probably don't realize right now how powerful that will be, but that's very much something that can unlock and free up a lot of leeway in the way monetary policy is being conducted. That's not to say that those instruments did not exist before. They did exist, and we had EIB bonds, we had ESM bonds, but that was not exactly the same, and the size of the markets was too tiny for this to really make a difference in terms of loosening the constraint of asset purchases. Now, while I'm at it, and also because I really believe this is the key advance for building monetary union, I think, and Commissioner Gentiloni mentioned it, that the sure issuance last week was really telling us a story that we had an intuition of, which is that there's a huge investor appetite for such an instrument. And not only because in the world we have a very a strong shortage of safe assets, but also because it sends a message for Europe as I mean, even the EU by translation, but for EMU as a whole and for the euro as a whole. So when we look at how this happened, you had a bid to cover ratio. I mean, Commissioner Gentiloni knows it better than me. I think it was 230 billion out of an issuance of 17, which is very high. The yield is a message. It's a AAA, but it's it's really in between the expensive paper and the cheap paper. So it's really making the job that we wanted it to be in terms of market signal, but also in terms of completing bond markets in the European space. So as such, I think even independently from where and how the money is going to be spent and how fast it's going to be spent, so independently from the power of the instrument as a fiscal policy instrument, but also as an investment policy as more as a whole, I think this is a step forward for Europe in the context of the recovery, but also a key step for the future. So I wouldn't repeat what has been said by some, but I think if this were to become permanent, that would be a very good idea now that this is up and running. Now, to come more concretely, and you were mentioning that I've been working in European institutions, including the European Investment Bank. So in a sense, and I was at the EIB when we were discussing the Juncker plan, the mechanisms that we could find to have a sort of multiplayer effect, the mechanisms that we needed to find to have a good complementarity between the public money that is being spent, but even more importantly, the private money that is being spent for investment purposes. And I think here, and that's where the call for a coordination mechanism across member states is so key. And we haven't seen that yet. I mean, from what we've seen so far, it's probably too early, but we haven't seen any sign of, France and Italy sort of having joint statements saying, okay, we will join forces and on the train network in Europe. We haven't had those kind of statements. There would be space for that. And I think one of the risks is that independently from when the money comes, but is that those plans are implemented one by one without really investigating the externalities, the cross-border externalities. This is something that we had already for the Juncker plan, but this is something that still prevails because the fields, the areas we are thinking of are very much the same. So there's no reason why this would have gone away now. I think one discussion that took place among economists recently, and we had those discussions in France at least with Philippe Aguillon and other people who are looking, including myself now at Sciences Po, at the financing of innovation. The governance of the projects pipeline will be absolutely key. And we are looking here at the US. You know, I don't know if you may or may not find this a good example, but the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the US, has a governance which is very, very agile, very long-term focused, but also short-term reactive, which acts a bit as an investment fund, but an investment fund with a mandate, which is basically a technological mandate and an innovation mandate for the public interest. So I think here it would be worth now having really a go at working very, granularly at the governance of what could be generating those projects to be financed. Again, here, a little bit of flavor of the Juncker plan. Lots of very good things happened and very nice solutions were found, but there were also some more gray areas of some projects that got financed that maybe didn't need to be necessarily at the top of the pile. Now, a last point maybe on this, and then I won't take too much time, but in this process, it will be key, and that's also spelled out that way in NextGen EU. There needs to be a focus on how public money can bring in private money. We know we have huge savings being piled up by European households, European non-financial corporations, for reasons that we understand. You know, the COVID crisis forced us collectively to either increase risk aversion or to not spend. This money is there, needs to be spent in a way that is complementary to the way public money is being spent. So I think, and there are ways here to assess the strength of the multipliers of the cross, public-private investment multipliers that can be at their highest level. We at the EIB, we had developed models on this, and there are relatively standard macroeconomic modeling tools that can give a sort of an idea of what can be the most efficient in terms of maximizing investment and maximizing potential growth. Notice that I've shifted now from the pure recovery mindset to a really structural mindset, because I think here we have it's an opportunity that we should miss for this direction. And last on this, I think it will be key to develop impact assessment tools. So impact assessment tools to see ex ante and ex post what the impact will be on, on firm level productivity, on macroeconomic growth, on convergence across countries, etc. So it's really ex ante, ex post, but also at the micro and macro level. So I will stop here if we have time for questions. I'll be happy to dig more deeply in those points, but yeah, that's it from my side.
Many thanks, Natacha, for having complemented with these two dimensions, the more general, so the role of all the policies, and also the more micro, the project level dimension, the introductory contribution of the Commissioner. Now moving to your cookies. So Germany also the presidency of the EU since July. Germany played a key role actually in getting through the Next Generation EU at the Council. But at the same time, Germany is one member state which have been responding very strongly to the crisis. So I guess it would be interesting to hear from you the two different dimensions. So how basically you are looking at Next Generation EU, but also the role of the national response to the crisis, also in relation to the EU response. Please, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think the challenges that we had when we were thinking about responses in late February and early March was, of course, how we avoid some of the mistakes that were highlighted by responses in the past. And I still remember, reading Natacha's papers post the financial crisis, on the asymmetry of the European response back then, when some member states had the fiscal space to respond strongly, but others that didn't have the fiscal space even went into austerity after the financial crisis, when expansion would have been called for. And I think that was really behind a lot of the thinking early on in this crisis. Of course, how do you, in each member state, unleash the power of bonds at the fiscal level? But then immediately also, how do we make sure that Europe acts in a symmetric fashion? Because, you know, I think there's not a much better example for a exogenous symmetric shock as the one that we're undergoing and that we've been undergoing for the past months. So the symmetry of the response is, of course, extremely important. And the second big construction difficulty, I think, is the whole history of Europe and its asymmetry between a very far advanced monetary integration and a not very far advanced fiscal integration. And of course, those two angles overlap quite massively. So in that sense, I think what we try to do on the one side, of course, is to make sure that all of the economically sound research on the importance of Germany for the European recovery, given the spillover effects that we have if we go into expansionary fiscal policy, is deployed fully, right? So we deliberately decided in March what Olaf Scholz called the Bazooka approach, i.e. to essentially learn from the origin of OMT and make sure that economic agents understand that there is no such thing as rushing to try to get fiscal money and loan guarantees and short-term labor schemes, but that we made the commitment that we are there and will be fully there for whatever volume is requested in terms of loan guarantees or short-term unemployment schemes. Those were the really two big important early stage responses, and I think the strong take-up of both of these instruments showed that we somewhat calmed markets then. But the other point, of course, is the 18th of March experience that we all underwent, and I think that highlights my second point, namely the dissonance of deep monetary integration and lack of fiscal integration, because I think on the 18th of March we all painfully experienced that we have one actor in Europe who can act quickly and decisively, and that is the ECB. And if we didn't have the ECB on the 18th of March, I don't want to know how the 19th would have looked like, you know. So I think we all learned that on that day that fiscal policy better get its act together and respond quickly. And Paolo gave a quick insight into what we did from the Monday to Thursday until the 9th of April with the joint fiscal response by the expanded Eurogroup and the 540 billion loan program that was put together in April. And I think that was also an extremely important response, and we're seeing the dividends of that with SURE now. I'm sure with the EIB guarantee program, we'll see further dividends also going into a lot of the areas that Natacha mentioned on corporate financing. And if and when needed, then the ESM's facility on funding of health measures is also available very quickly. So I think that was sort of the turning point where markets understood that we're no longer in the each member state for its own monetary policy versus fiscal policy asymmetry mode, but we're in real coherence mode. And I think that was also, of course, for us a huge motivation, and the positive response that we received from the April program to start discussing with other member states and the Commission, and of course with the privileged amitié franco-allemande with our friends in Paris, how we could set up the promise that was also originated in one of these 4 nights in April, namely because if you read the Eurogroup statement from April, that already contains sort of the birth of the what we now call the RRF in it, because we decided that the 540 billion loan program wasn't everything. And so I think we pretty quickly got our act together then to make sure that the debate around a stabilization facility becomes operational as quickly as possible. And I think, from April to July is not a very long time period that we got the RRF together. And of course, for us as presidency, we had the huge motivation then on July 21st, when after 4 further nights of negotiating, we basically told everyone here in the ministry, guess what? There's a rumor in the world that Europe goes on vacation in August. We're here to prove that rumor wrong. Because we said we need basically the legal text of implementing the 67 pages of council conclusions that the heads of state and government made, within 3 or 4 weeks, so we can get this thing operational and up and running and really handleable and fungible by the time that everyone returns in September. And I think we got that negotiated fairly quickly. We now in October, after very intensive negotiations in September, got the ECOFIN to agree on the legal text for the Recovery and Resilience Facility. We're now in debates with the European Parliament that will start trilogue very soon, within the next few weeks. I think we're very far advanced on the legal text of the own resources decision. We're very encouraged and motivated to talk to Paolo's team, which we've been doing, to also implement the sort of, I would say, Hamiltonian components of the agreement of heads of state and government, namely to think about what further and future own resources could be. We had a very motivating informal ECOFIN in September that actually took place in person, where we had economists and the finance ministers debating around what those own resources could be for the European Union going forward. And we're very happy to see that the Commission is already planning and putting together concrete measures to not only form the fiscal response that we have now, with the importance of own issuance of debt and the accumulation of safe assets and the ability for investors to use those as diversification tools, but also, which I think is equally important, for the EU to develop its own mechanism for financing itself. So I think that those are the really forward-looking components. That of course, the RRF is a one-off facility. That's the political agreement that was struck, but in it is really the core of something that could be much more powerful than a one-off instrument. And I think this coherence of fiscal response, the ability for own resources to be developed, several decades of availability of a European safe asset that through the long period of lifetime for the RRF is something that will be recurring, and these issuance will come up over and over again. So I think that is extremely powerful. And I think that last but not least, I do want to mention what's extremely important, because it got under some, it doesn't get mentioned often enough, I think, that European competition policy really showed its unifying force. I mean, the amount of time we spend in March and April with Commissioner Vestager, Olivier Garçon and their teams to get the European Union on a common ground on exemptions to the competition framework, and getting the temporary framework implemented so quickly, with hundreds of decisions being made in record time, I think also shows powerful European unity, where we complement monetary policy, fiscal policy, with also a very coherent competition policy. And I think that's important. And last but not least, of course, the whole future orientation of our measures. I just mentioned the EIB program that I think is now being finalized and will become operational soon, and that has a very, very substantial component of the ability of the EIB through EIF to incentivize and fund equity investments into technology, startups, and young growth companies. I think that's also extremely important, that we don't only talk about the quantitative approach of this program, but also the qualitative element. And we're putting together a 10 billion future fund in startup investments, Cédric and the team in France are putting together very innovative concepts for the financing of startup companies. So I think the governments at the EU level, but also at the member state level, have also understood that it's not only about the sheer size of the fiscal response and quantitative measures, but also this growth enhancing measures that surround the two key words of green and digital. So I think with that, my last hope is that we get this all agreed between member states, the European Parliament soon, because money has to flow quickly. Otherwise, we will have failed. I think that's the key thing that we really need to spend the rest of the year to finalize this agreement, so that money starts flowing early in 21. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I would like to invite all attendees to participate in the discussion by typing questions using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the screen. While we wait for questions, actually, I would like to pick up on one point which was made earlier, and actually it's also somehow in one of the questions which have been already sent. And this is mostly addressed to Commissioner Gentiloni, but I would be interested in hearing the views also of other speakers. Now, we are clearly in a second wave of the pandemic. Is there any possibility that the recovery facility is somewhat redesigned, or the discussion is reopened in the direction of, for instance, a higher size, or maybe a reorientation of how the money should be spent?
Well, I think we should not forget the fact that we are still committed with an enormous effort from the German presidency that Jörg was also mentioning about holidays, in the implementation of what was decided, and we should not undermine this process. This process is there. We have to conclude the negotiations with the co-legislators. We need the approval of the Parliament next month, if possible in the first session, if not in the second one, and then the ratification process. This doesn't mean that this is sufficient, that we cannot discuss the possibility of further initiatives or involvement of other tools or reorientation of tools that are not at the moment fully used. But all this discussion is providing that we are not undermining the process of implementation of what was decided. And indeed, if I may, we knew, of course, everyone was much more optimistic in summer than now. But we knew that a second phase was quite possible and even probable. It was not a complete surprise. And we know that this is not a war. You don't have a moment where the war finishes and the reconstruction begins. We will have to manage together emergency and recovery, and we should keep the quality of the recovery, not changing this strategic quality. So yes, we can do more. We can think to the reorientation of tools that we have in our toolbox to face the new emergency. But first, what is crucial is the message to member states keep supportive fiscal stance, react, continue the support without too soon canceling the measures of support. And this is crucial, and the ECB role from this point of view is crucial. At the same time, can we give a contribution at European level? The contribution can be given without undermining Next Generation EU, and working first of all for coordination of the reaction. What is happening in our borders should be, I think, better coordinated, and I hope that in the European Council video conference on Thursday, this could be one of the results, how we better coordinate travel restriction, border decisions, and all this. So there is, in one word, we can do more, but without undermining the implementation of what we have decided.
Thanks very much. Jörg, would you like to add maybe to what the commissioner said?
No, I can only agree. I think this is a very, very delicate, very difficult compromise that was reached with very, very intense debate. So I think opening it up again is a recipe for being very counterproductive. So I think like there's so much volume in there. There is flexibility. I mean, if you look at the RF rules, member states do have flexibility in how they allocate, how quickly they deploy. So I do think there is the ability, for example, in the choice of which funds flow how quickly in the member states. If a member state says we now, given the new situation, want to deploy more in the earlier years, I think there is some flexibility built in. But I think a debate now around overall volumes and the core elements of the agreement would be very counterproductive, because it would lead those who are critical about the volume to then say. So I think reopening the debate at this stage would not be productive.
Thanks. Maybe I move to Natacha to follow up actually on a point that you mentioned. It was mentioned also by other speakers. So there is quite a lot of money available. I mean, we made some calculation for some countries can be 5-6% of GDP. So we are potentially, and so we are really looking about a large amount of money. One point which was made by the Commissioner is how to make sure that actually these resources are absorbed and are used for the right purpose. Natacha, you hinted at this in your initial contribution. So that the question is how to make sure that the money is channeled towards projects which are leading towards more resilient economy and reorganize the economy in a certain way. Now, in this, I think it's quite important, of course, the capacity of the member states, the question about the role of control or monitoring, if you want, of the Commission, and how this can be implemented. I understand that you have already had some thoughts on this. If you would like to share maybe the reflection.
I think, thanks for the question. I think the fact that we are in a second wave, the fact that this is all being cumulative matters a lot. So on the one hand, we should probably think that fiscal policy comes here as a purely counter-cyclical instrument to support disposable income, to avoid, labor market developments to become uncontrolled and to destroy potential, input for potential growth in a long-lasting way. So this logic doesn't change. Now, what changes a little bit, perhaps, but that's a political choice that national member states have to make, is whether every single euro that's being spent on those counter-cyclical logics is being spent in the most efficient way. One example of this is a euro spent on a chômage partiel as efficient as a euro spent on a delay given for tax payments to an SME? I don't have the answer, But what I know is that the euro spent on the labor market will support, domestic demand and will support disposable income. A euro spent in delaying a tax payment on a firm or an SME or restaurant that already is in difficulties, whose business model has been really fundamentally put in question with the evolution of the economy that comes as a result of the pandemic, I'm not so sure. So what I'm saying is that at some point we'll have to face the structural consequences on the supply side, and we'll probably have to stop giving those transitory subsidies to sectors where we understand that the structural change would need to happen. And at some point we'll have to switch to something that really reallocates capital to other sectors, to other families of companies. This is also true for human capital. So I think we should start thinking about training. Unemployment is, the logics of what has been put in place is understandable, but the longer it lasts, the more prone we will be to, the more exposed the economy will be to longer term unemployment or jobs that will not be fit anymore for the new structure of the economy when the recovery really takes place. And so I think now is the time, and that's where the differences arise between now and back then in March when everything started. And I think we should have this in mind. Now there's a third dimension, which is what you were hinting to, is how to make sure when it comes to financing those structural changes and how to make sure that the money is really being allocated in a way that is productive. I think we need structures, and that's where Europe can help. I think it would be very helpful to have at the European level impact assessment teams that could work cross-border, that could be sector-specific. I don't need to discuss any geographical allocation, but you could have those competencies to monitor the unfolding of the project and the results of the project in a way that is being done professionally by investors, including public sector investors such as the EIF and the EIB. And I think mentioning the EIF, the EIB, the EIF-based EIB facility is a very beautiful example. Anytime I hear a company, and at Sciences Po we have a lot of exposure to our finance, masters in finance, masters in impact finance. They are looking for those competencies, and they love to see the EIF as co-investor. They love to see the BPI in France being co-investors, because that helps them, because they know the due diligence will be done in a good way, because they know that all the the skills of the engineers, of the people who are able to assess the viability of a project will be deployed in a way that probably smaller, more specific investors will not be able to do. So I think here there's a lot of work. We should not underestimate the implementation, the selection, implementation, and assessment phase of the project if we really want to have an impact on potential growth at the EU level.
Thanks very much. Let me move to something slightly different. There are a couple of questions which basically from the attendees going in the direction of whether the Next Gen EU or the resilience facility can be seen as a future fiscal capacity. Now, let me just share a few personal thoughts. So I've been working for some years on the EU fiscal capacity and the idea of EU fiscal capacity. So when basically the proposal came in, the first question we tried to discuss, it was, is this a fiscal capacity? And my answer was no, because the way we look at fiscal capacity is something which can act very fast and can mitigate and absorb the impact of a shock. The way I was looking at the response to the COVID is that national governments actually played this key role. The governments, let's leave aside monetary policy, but the governments, national governments came in with very fast response in order to absorb the shock. the way I'm looking at the EU response is something which is actually much more focused on the long term, really on the restructuring of the economy to take up longer term challenges. Now, the question is my reading correct? And in fact, if governments will be more in difficulty in keeping this shock mitigation role, can we look at the EU response more as a shock absorption tool? Anyone who would like to give share his or her thoughts? Commissioner?
No, well, I think we have to be very clear on what we have decided and what the potential consequences of this decision could be. What we have decided is a extraordinary measure, as we say in our discussion and our documents, a one-off decision. It is in some of its aspects, it is already contributing to member states. For example, the SURE mechanism is in place. And as Natacha was saying before, the issuance for the SURE mechanism was very reassuring, especially maybe because I am Italian, of course, but especially it was reassuring the fact that 2 days after this issuance, we had a 30 years issuance of Italian 30 years BTP, and they were in one of the lowest interest rates on record. And this also explains that there is not a risk of endanger weaker paper with this emission. So something is already flowing and in place. The rest will come in the next months. But yes, it is a extraordinary decision. Then, if we look to the consequences of this extraordinary decision, I think it is quite honest to say, if we look back to the experience of the building of the European project, that if this works, it will open the way for the potential permanent fiscal capacity. I think that this discussion will come automatically by a good use of these funds.
Jörg, maybe your view?
Yeah, I think if you go through the brief history of the Corona crisis, you can see that it's all about financial conditions, right? I mean, if you follow the path from February, when the first signs of crisis came to light, until the 18th of March, we saw exactly the classic crisis response that Europe also had, I would say, after the global financial crisis, namely a divergence of funding spreads, i.e. money flowed into bunds, and our levels went more negative. Other spreads widened, leading to a complete asymmetry of financing conditions. The 18th of March fixed that to a large extent, but if you look at the further evolution, when then afterwards markets saw that it's not only a monetary response, but also a fiscal response, we saw this convergence and tightening of spreads overall that Paolo gave the example of the 30-year BTP for, happening very systematically. And I think that's really the core, where you then get into a much more realistic scenario of a symmetric response, and I would say less of a reliance on a central fiscal capacity, because if the decentralized respective fiscal capacities can avoid the divergence of financing conditions and terms at which they can access markets, both at the sovereign, but also, I think, importantly, at the corporate and financial players levels, then it leads to a much higher level of coherence and convergence between the macroeconomic impact. And I think that's really the sort of second round important thing that our fiscal response signaled to the market. We all remember after the financial crisis, all of the redenomination risk fears that were in the markets that then led to spillover effects. First, then financial institutions losing market access in the second round, then corporate, that whole thing splitting over in the corporate sector. And like the fact that we cut off that factor and even turned it into the contrary with a joint tightening of funding levels in all member states, I think is really important for the creation of fiscal space, or at least the ability to access markets at reasonable funding rates in all markets in a very coherent way. And I think that economically, like researchers 2, 3, 5 years ago in the future look back at this probably will be seen as one of the core differences between the crisis response this time versus the last time. And hopefully it'll also avoid the sort of negative second round effects that we had after the global financial crisis.
Many thanks, Jörg. I think this is actually a very important point, which is not, most of the time, it's not actually captured in a standard analysis. Natacha, maybe 1 minute, you would like to come in on this topic?
Yes, on this, your question on the future, the fiscal capacity, I think this will be self-fulfilling, and this will be selecting the right or the wrong equilibrium. And the way in which the money will be spent, the speed at which and where it will be spent, will tell us 3 things. 1, the shape of the recovery in every member state. 2, the signal it will send about potential growth for Europe. And 3, the sort of perenniality of the euro. And those 3 things will be telling us whether this first test, as Jörg was saying, last time we had those redenomination risks, and that was really everything was at stake and stuff. If we can get away with those 3 points with positive signals, then I think it will be sort of, the proof of the cake will be in the eating. Nobody will have strong arguments to say we shouldn't move forwards at the pace we want to have towards the fiscal capacity.
Thanks very much. We are approaching the end. I have a very last question for Commissioner. There were a couple of questions pointing to the fact that one key element in all this discussion about fiscal capacity in the end is about own resources and especially tax revenues. And the question, both questions point at whether that there is a real discussion on whether a part of, for instance, VAT, receipts, or other tax revenues can be collected at EU level for redistribution purpose.
Yes, well, there is not only a discussion, there is a clear commitment from our side, also because it is one of the negotiating issues with the Parliament. One of the things that the Parliament asked to the Council in the negotiation is to have a clear schedule of commitments from the Commission on own resources and taxation. And this will be, I think, important for our near future, because we will come with proposals in the first semester of next year, both on this carbon border mechanism and the relation of this mechanism with the emission trade system, on the issues that we are discussing now at the G20 OECD level, so digital and minimal taxation, on energy taxation, and also taking again in our hands maybe with a general proposal the financial transaction proposals. All this is important, of course, to build the agreement with the Parliament, of course, to begin the repayment of this recovery fund in 2026, but also, as Jörg was saying, this is one of the bases of the strategic success of this operation. If we are able to repay with common resources, is absolutely important for the future.
Many thanks, Commissioner. Many thanks to Natacha and to Jörg for the participation and the contribution. It was very interesting. I wish you all to stay healthy and best of luck in your functions. And I hope we will have the opportunity to meet in person soon. Thanks very much and have a good afternoon. Bye.
Grazie. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Grazie.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Cinzia.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.